Okay, so first, unlike what we usually do in class where we tell people to put their devices away, I'd like you to take your devices out and get them ready on the conference hashtag OER15 and on a new hashtag called OER Plan, and we're going to use this one in the second half. But please do tweet throughout. I always go back and look at tweets at the end and try to answer any questions that you might have if we don't have time, given this is a fairly short keynote. So I'm trying to stay with the conference theme. This talk is all about taking OER mainstream. So what do we actually need to do as a community and how we operate as we move forward? Of course, all of these slides are under a Creative Commons attribution license. Martin's got a copy, and I'm confident he'll put them up on the website. So first, a few good news components. As Martin Weller said, we are now 13, 14 years into OER. We've had a lot of success. There's a lot of momentum. There's some things that are going right. And some of this has become infrastructure, which is good. Without infrastructure, it's more difficult to work on the higher levels of the pyramid. You can't have an economy in a country without a good transportation infrastructure, for example. And there are some things that we have debated and argued about in the past around the OER space, which I'm glad to say are starting to become infrastructures so that we can focus on more important things. So the first one is definition. And you may not use this definition. This is the Hewlett definition. It doesn't really matter which OER definition that you use. What matters is that the definition that you use has this. So for something to be an open educational resource, it must be free, and you must have the legal rights to do what David Wiley calls the 5 R's. Right? So you must legally have to be able to reuse, revise, remix, redistribute, and retain. And this last one, retention, is increasingly critical because, as we know, the commercial textbook publishers are moving to a new mode where they don't sell books or educational resources to your students. Therefore, there is no used textbook market. They actually lease access, and at the end of the lease, 180 days usually, your access goes away. So the cost might be less than the high cost of buying an educational resource, but you lose access to it. That, my friends, is artificial scarcity, information abundance, and we should not stand for it in our education. So one thing that we're seeing increasingly, as the green movement and other movements have seen, is this concept of washing. So there's green washing. I don't know if you remember when in the Gulf in the United States, massive oil spill, and all of a sudden we had commercial American television with nice green banners around the outside talking about how green the oil companies were. Well, we're seeing the same thing with open washing, and on my other computer here I've got up on the screen Udacity's program called the Open Education Alliance, and there's really not much open about it other than the word open in the title of it. And so I think Audrey Waters nailed it when she said that open washing has a nice clean definition, and we need to defend against it. So when somebody calls something an open education, ask them, is it easy to use? Is it easy to get access to? Is it in an editable format so that I can leverage my legal rights to do those 5 things? Second piece of infrastructure which has really emerged is the licensing. Right? Creative Commons, this is where I work, so clearly I'm biased on this point. But the world has shifted. When they want to share copyrighted resources, they use standard open copyright licenses. Yes, there are still custom licenses which flare up from time to time around copyright. There's a discussion happening in the UK right now about whether or not there should be a government license specifically for the UK for open access research articles, and that's being kind of pushed back right now because, of course, it doesn't meet with the spirit of openness with anybody in the world that might want to access that research, but it's also possible to restrict access to something once it's online and once it's got a license on it. Okay, so Creative Commons licenses, I'm not going to go into this, you're all familiar, but there are options. We've got 6 open copyright licenses. There are more and more of them around the world. We're now well north of 1 billion licenses on the web. If you haven't seen this, this is our latest State of the Commons report. Also showed where the licenses are near as we can see them. You can see that where we are here in Europe, it's very, very active, and other parts of the world are coming up fast. So in fact, there's some of the biggest growth right now in Africa. The other trend that we spot is that, for those of you who follow this sort of thing, the free culture CC0, what works in the public domain, CC BY and BY-SA, are increasing in their use as an overall percentage of the license suite. So in 2010, those licenses and the public domain tools were roughly 40% of use, and now they're north of 56%. And so to the extent in education that we care about having as much flexibility and freedoms in use of works as possible, that's a good thing for us. It's also quite active. So Creative Commons, as you know, serves up license deeds. When people click on the little license, you get the license deed, and we're serving up to the tune of roughly 27 million of those per day now, and that doesn't include any of the platforms that use open licenses. So Flickr, YouTube, et cetera, those are all additional numbers. These are just individuals' websites out there that are openly licensing their work. And this is a remix from my friend Nicole Allen, who's sitting here, and she said, look, you know, if we're going to think about which licenses work with the standard OER definition, let's be clear about it, and she's right. These licenses down to the BY and CSA license would be considered OER licenses. The two ND licenses, the no derivatives, they violate every OER definition out there because you don't have the legal rights to make modifications and repurpose it to meet your needs. And when I, least freedom to most freedom, we're talking about how much flexibility, how many degrees of freedom are we giving to other people downstream so they can use the good work that we or others were willing to share. Okay, so that's just a bit of infrastructure. That's all good news. We create that, it's out there. It's not too exciting, but it's necessary for what we're doing in open educational resources. Second, we have a very strong value proposition around OER. Now on the airplane, where's Brian? See here? There he is. So on the plane, I'm reading a post from Brian, and it's a really great post. If you haven't seen it, it's called Open Ends, and in it, Brian talks about open as a tactic rather than a goal, and it's a very, I thought, well thought out blog post, and he says, look, is the end to have a lot of open educational resources, or is the end to move toward open practices and new open pedagogies where we can really think about learners not sitting in the audience and having sages on the stage, but rather having people in an environment where they can co-construct knowledge and they can create the curriculum together as they move forward. And all the wonderful things that the Canadians spearheaded with their CMOOCs before it was, before we had the XMOOC takeover. And I think that's right. I think that OER is ultimately part of the infrastructure the same way that the definition infrastructure or the licenses are infrastructure. I think in the end, OER simply becomes part of the infrastructure to get to the real value proposition of open education, which is people learning in new ways. And in his post, and I'll quote here, is a statement from Tony Hurst, whose his statement of academic philosophy, and I quote, open practice is, quote, driven by the idea of learning with the aim of communicating academic knowledge information and as part of wider communities of practice, modeling learning behavior through demonstrating learning processes and originating new ideas in a challengeable and open way as part of my own learning journey. And I think that's what we're ultimately shooting for. We still have a lot of open education resources, infrastructure work to do, and that's where I'll focus most of this talk. So some of the value propositions. Well, we've got many, and I was having breakfast with somebody who I hadn't met, and we were talking about how do you sway, convince, persuade faculty to engage in OER, and my advice was you try on many of these different value propositions and you find one that works for them. So certainly we talk about reducing barriers through increasing access, reducing costs. Languages, somebody asked me this morning if the CC licenses were in Welsh or not. I don't believe they are, but our licenses are dedicated to the public domain, and so very quickly we can have a translation project and get all the licenses translated into Welsh. The second one here is really what Brian's getting at. We have an opportunity to transform teaching and learning through open practice and think about what it means to learn, and I'm going to come back to this theme a little bit later. We can enable free access to and reuse of all of human knowledge. That, in essence, is the mission the vision of Creative Commons. This is what we're fundamentally working on, not just in education, but in science and other sectors of society as well. Enhancing educational opportunities, foster development of more productive and free societies. Certainly, this is critical. A lot of teachers talk about reprofessionalizing teaching, both in primary, secondary, and tertiary. Professors in tertiary education are starting to say, you know, I'm now receiving a box of textbook materials and all the ancillary resources from publishers, and I'm teaching out of this box, and that doesn't feel good anymore. Take back control of the resources that I'm putting together, and with OER, obviously they have the legal rights to remix as they see fit. Connecting communities of educators around the world, like Brian said, with the thinking about open practices and teaching new ways, I think this is fundamentally the next stage of education, where all of the professors around the world, introduction to statistics, are actually engaged in a conversation with each other about what works, what doesn't work, what's exciting, what data have you collected, what resources do you use, which new simulations work well with your students, what can your students share with my students. We really are bad at this in education, and with open educational resources, it's a bridge to engage in these new ways of working. Increasing the efficiency and effectiveness of public funds, absolutely. I'm going to come back to open policy later. It's I think, borders on immoral and unethical behavior the way that we spend public funds today on education. All publicly funded resources should be openly licensed by default. To do anything less is simply a massive waste of money. And to the extent that, and you're feeling this acutely in the United Kingdom right now, there is a systematic divestment or lack of investment in public, and many countries are pulling back, including the UK, the United States, and others, or they're staying flat as inflation rises, and that's a problem. And then, of course, almost every country in the world has some kind of initiative around increasing digital technologies in school, having one-to-one laptop or tablet or smartphone programs for students, increasing bandwidth to schools and to learners wherever they might be. And to the extent that that's happening, that's a place to weave in especially digital OER. Okay, so we've got lots of positive stories, lots of reasons to move to OER, and that's positive. There's also a lot of OER research out there that's happened over the past 4 or 5 years, which is quite encouraging and also in places where there's work to do. So this is, where's Martin? Martin, look, I got my new sticker here. This is OER Research Hub. If you all don't have one of these, you need to get a sticker. Got to represent. So the OER Research Hub, which Martin and his colleagues lead, has done some really amazing work in talking with faculty really all over the planet about how they're engaging OER, why they're engaging, et cetera. And the results are really impressive. Using OER improves student satisfaction, test scores go up. I'm adapting resources to meet my needs. Inspired and getting new ideas from OER. I'm studying at no cost the opportunity to study at no cost was one of the reasons I used OER. I'm having a new learning experience. More educators who use OER are more willing to share. It's having a positive impact on my course of study. Students say this is saving me a lot of money. We know that's the case because it's free. It's a chance to try university-level content before signing up for a paid course. This is part of the MOOC story, right? We hook them in with free, professionally developed resources, and then hopefully they'll come and become our students. We're using OER to influence our decision whether or not we take a particular course or register. And I go on and take a paid course after taking some free OER opportunities. All good things. They also point out some real challenges. It's difficult to find OER. The general knowledge of OER is still low. I'll show some additional research around that for a minute. Only 12% of faculty are publishing OER under CC licenses. So again, this is why definition becomes very important. If somebody says that, yes, I'm producing OER and it's all rights reserved copyright, you need to talk with them about that. You know, well, in fact, it would be illegal for me to take a copy of your work and slice it up. Again, the person I was having breakfast with was sharing, and I won't name who the person was, but was sharing her course under an open license, under a Creative Commons license, and one of her colleagues took that course, remixed it, which is exactly what she wanted to have there's no attribution given in that course, and that's a problem. And this one I find particularly interesting. 15% of informal OER with an open license, allowing adaptation despite the fact that 87% say that they're adapting the resources to fit their needs, which raises a red flag for me. And either they're violating copyright or maybe they're using dealing rights. But either way, part of this conversation is to make sure that people understand the law and are actually following copyright law in whatever country they might be in. And of course, brand awareness of OER is low, many obstacles. Here's some research from the United States. This is from the US PIRGs, which Nicole used to lead and others have taken the helm now. 65% of students are skipping courses because of the high cost of textbooks. They do it even knowing that it is going to harm their grades in their course. We've got a whole generation of students saying, I can't afford it. I know I'm not going to do as well, but because it's expensive, I'm not going to engage. That's a fundamental problem, especially when we can provide open textbooks and other resources. They're taking fewer courses. They're dropping because of the high cost of textbooks. And we know that if you replace the cost of textbooks, and this is United States data, that you're saving students upwards of $130 per course. There's a nice new set, kind of a summary of a lot of OER research out there if you haven't seen it yet. It's at the Open Education Group at Brigham Young University. This is where David Wiley used to work, but his colleagues, John Hilton and others, continue that good work. And that website is up there, openedgroup.org/review. And it's a very nice summary of the work that's happening. And the Hewlett Foundation continues to fund Jeff Seaman to do work, and he just came out with his 2014 survey of faculty. And we don't have time to go through all his results, but I'm going to show two. One of them is that 66% are really completely unaware of OER. He also found, and if you add in some other groups, it's closer to 75%. He also found that the 25% that really know about OER are actually quite passionate about it and are actually become advocates and teach others about it. So once we can raise the awareness of OER and provide some professional development and help people engage OER, they're actually quite sold, but this is a massive awareness problem that's on us to solve. And there's many strategies to get there. The other, I don't know if this is troubling or informative data, which I found particularly interesting, is the criteria that faculty use for selecting their resources. And at the top of the list here, if you can't read it, it's proven efficacy, trusted quality, covers a wide range of subjects, and works with my learning management system. That all makes sense. At the bottom, though, are faculty ratings and cost. So, are you not concerned about cost? Well, because faculty don't have to pay, right? So part of our awareness raising is actually raising the awareness of how much educational resources cost and the negative effects it's having on their students. So in the United States, Nicole and others walk around and say, did you know that roughly 67% of your students are not buying at least one of the educational resources for your classes? And how do you faculty feel about your students not having the resources that you designed as the professor for them to be successful in your class? And faculty say, well, I don't like that very much. I guess I should be concerned about cost. But without the awareness raising, this is the kind of criteria. The other thing I think it's informative for us is that we are going to have to be on these top bullet points with our research, with our efficacy studies, to show faculty and convince them that OER is something that they ought be reusing, but also be producing and sharing. So if proven efficacy is what they want, then we're proven efficacy studies and show them. If trusted quality is what they want, we're going to need to bring them resources that look high quality, that meet whatever their definition of quality is. That's a whole nother keynote about debating quality. Other good news is we've got a lot of momentum in OER. We don't have time to go through the thousands of OER projects around the world, but let me highlight just a few here locally, which I find particularly impressive. One is, where's Alec? There's Alec. Alec Markowski here from Poland is leading one called the Oer Policy in Europe, where they're working on open policies in OER. The Leicester City Council and OER schools, that we'll have a keynote on that later. Very impressive program. If you haven't seen this, you should check it out. And there's some great literature on the front desk. Opening up Slovenia. Nicole's going to talk about what they're doing with the Open Government Partnership later. Open Scotland. Lorna, where are you? So if you don't know Lorna, talk with Lorna. She's leading some great work in Scotland, and they've got a national declaration around OER. Opening up education in Europe. You all know about this. The European Commission's putting money and a lot of money into many OER projects. And then I wanted to highlight just one from the United Take off, and that's what the Hewlett Foundation is calling a Z degree, which started with one community college in the United States, which took an entire degree program to OER. Some really amazing outcomes in terms of not only reducing cost to students, but also in improving course completion rates, reducing dropout, reducing time to degree, increasing the amount of tuition that they're collecting, et cetera. And it was so successful that, that they're actually now looking at expanding that broadly across the US and then hopefully around the world. So given that this is my keynote, I thought it would be okay to say what I would like to see in the world. And if you don't like these ideas, blame Martin Weller. He's the one that invited me. So as OER goes mainstream, this is what I'd like to see and what I spend my time working on. I'd like to see the default set to open on money. So, and when I say that, I mean foundations in the world that are giving people money to do things in education, or governments that put out discretionary optional grants, money to build professional development programs, to build new academic programs, to build new textbooks, whatever it might be. And in fact, individual institutions that have innovation funds or discretionary funds that they give to faculty. My ask of all of them is to stop giving people money without making an open license requirement on it. Put it in a more positive way. If you take this money, you'll openly license what you build, or you can't have the money. And not to be rude or to be too blunt, but that's essentially what it comes down to. Put another way, all publicly funded resources and research resources ideally would have a CC BY license on them, or they'd be dedicated to the public domain using CC0, and we should have no embargo period on publicly funded resources. So in open access, it's very common to have a 6 or oftentimes 12 or longer embargo period before the public has access to what the public pays for. Ideally, there's no embargo period. I think ultimately, again, back to the infrastructure part of OER, we need textbooks in all subjects, all education grade levels available, openly and freely available, openly licensed, in editable formats, in any language that anybody might want. So here's what we really ought to be shooting for with our policies. We complain in higher education and in primary and secondary about not having enough funds. We actually have plenty of money. We spend more than enough money through aid and other means on educational resources. We're just really bad at how we spend it. And if with one example I use or we call it K-12 in the United States, in my home state of Washington State, which oftentimes has weather like Wales, we spend, just in my state, on 1 million public school kids, 130 million US dollars a year on textbooks. And for that large amount of money, what we get are books that are 10 years out of date, paper only. The kids can't keep the books as they move from year to year. They're not allowed to write in them, et cetera. And on average, the books are 10 years out of date. Why? Because they're expensive and we can only afford to replace 2 or so out of the 100 in K-12 and our 8 subjects. And that's just silly. So, I sat down with our legislature recently and said, why don't you spend $100 million once, put out competitive RFPs, have up-to-date educational resources for all subjects, all grades, give them away freely under a CC BY license. If other states, other countries want to use them, fine. And then let's spend $25 million a year keeping those resources up. Give every student in our state digital OER, so it's always up to date, and we will give them printed copies if they want, because we can print them for $3 or $4 from Amazon's print-on-demand service, which is just up the street in Seattle. And every kid can keep the resources. Nobody's got out-of-date resources. And you used to spend $130 a year. Now you're spending $25 million a year. Take the money and go hire more teachers. Reduce class sizes. Have preschool for every kid, a tablet, and mobile service at home. Right? The money's there. We're just really, really bad at how we spend it. So to that end, many of us in the room got together and created a new global organization called the Open Policy Network, and ALT and others are members of this, and what we do is advocate for this. So the Open Policy Network works globally with governments and other funders to say, when you give money, please make sure that it is open by default. In fact, just 48 hours ago, I put out a note that the US State Department just put out a $2.5 million grant to build a new curriculum, and they required a CC BY license on what they built. So we're getting some small wins here and there. Another thing that the Open Policy Network launched recently is called the Institute for Open Leadership, and in a nutshell, this is training a new generation of open policy leaders around the world in different sectors of society. So another thing that I'd like to see, and this really goes back to Brian's post, is that learning solving global grand challenges. Challenges in the world. The sea levels are rising, in case you haven't noticed. We have droughts and clean water shortages in many places of the world. We have refugee crises. Borders are shifting. There are major discussion points and challenges that need to be solved. And I don't know about you, but for me, education is fundamentally about creating an educated citizenry to have more peaceful societies and have people be able to work with each other and communicate intelligently to solve big problems. And it also seems to me that if you're going to provide a good education to people, you would give them complex problems that need be solved and provide support around that. And I think OER and open practices and open pedagogy fit perfectly with the melding of solving these grand challenges. So if it were up to me, since again this is what Cable wants to see in the world, the OER, not only would we, the first bullet here, really do what Brian's talking about, but we would redefine what success in school means, and it means that you are contributing in a meaningful way to solving global grand challenges, right? So it might be that you walk into a class and your teacher says to you, here's OER on water security, but your assignment is actually to improve the curriculum. So, John, you're going to fix chapter 2 because it's outdated, because there's new research that just came out about how we can filter water more effectively at a much lower cost, and our textbook is out of date. Your job is to fix chapter 2. You're going to be graded on that not only by me and your colleagues in the class, but this is a meaningful assignment, John, because not only is this book going to affect the other students in your class, it's going to affect future cohorts of students that come through this class, but we're also going to make this book an open educational resource and share it with everybody else on the planet who's concerned about water security. And now John's saying, well, it's not just a throwaway assignment between me and the professor, but this actually matters. I'm actually producing something that's helping to solve problems. And the last thing that I don't want much. The last thing I want is that we start to use data in education. We're really, really bad at this. Part of the reason we're bad with this is, I mean, A, we don't use technology very well, and B, we're afraid of privacy. And we should be. We should be very cautious about that. We should protect people's privacy. We should have opt-out provisions in any data collection that happens. So if people don't want to have their data collected, we should say that's fine, we won't collect your data. But we should have a value proposition and a compelling argument and a set of tools and values that from the data collection hopefully persuade us to want to share our data. Because if we start to do this, we all of a sudden are in a position where we can iteratively improve OER and simulations that we use that is data-driven. And back to the global grand challenges, if we're collecting data on, say, water security, then we can actually share that data globally and how people are solving some of those problems. Okay, fine. So what do we do? Coming back to the conference theme, how do we actually take OER mainstream? So now I'm really moving into a remix of a document that I'm going to share for just a moment. So I wanted to give proper credit and attribution to that, and I'll share that URL in just a second. So first, we've got these declarations. You've probably all read these. The Capetown Declaration now is just about a decade old, I think. Paris OER Declaration, 4 or 5 years old. And these two declarations, if you haven't read them, you should. They outline the aspiration, the goals, the visions for where OER can do, what it can do, what governments can do. And the community, generally speaking, you may not agree with every point in it, but generally speaking, we agree that these are positive visions and things that we can, for the most part, agree on. And so I think it's probably not useful for us to have another big convening to write another declaration about why we should move to OER. Fine to revise these, but rather I think it's time for us, if we really do want OER to go mainstream, to start to talk about an implementation strategy. So components of any campaign, of any revolution, of any major change that need to occur, and occur in a collaborative, organized way, so that we can actually move past the tipping point of OER. And as Nicole often says, we're on a linear growth path right now with OER, and we'll get there eventually, but we really have the opportunity to have an exponential growth path, but we're not there, and without some of these components, frankly, we're not going to get there. So to actualize the full vision of OER, several of us, there were many people in this room who were at this meeting. It was a small group, though. It was only about 25 people. And we had this initial discussion about implementation. What might that look like? And how do we do that as a community globally in a way that's full of our group? And so what we came up with was this. So if you go to tinyurl.com/OER strategy, and I'll share this again at the end. It's tinyurl.com/OER strategy. You'll see a draft document, and I'm going to go through several of the main points. Not now, because I'd like you to participate in a different way, but we would very much like you to take some time, read through this document. You all have comment privileges on the doc. Please mark it up. And we're asking really everybody who's interested in OER around the world to do this. And we're having these types of conversations at many conferences over the next several months. So if you could take a bit of time and go through and ask yourself these questions. Would the OER movement benefit from a coordinated implementation strategy? And let me be clear, this is not about one organization telling another organization what to do. That's not it at all. This is much about getting in our heads, for example, that when I'm starting a major OER project, for example, to make sure that I'm asking myself the question, what research questions might I ask, or what should I be asking? And then for this, for ALT and others to say, who are the researchers that I ought to be talking to? So obviously I need to be talking with the OER Research Hub. I should probably ring up John Hilton at the Open Ed group, and I ping the Babson group as well, and have a quick conference call and just talk about what's the research that's already been done, where are the gaps, and what should I be doing in Wales. What's towns? For the most part, we don't do that. Okay, so it's really kind of getting at some of those opportunities. We want to know if you think this is the right list, and I'm going to go through them in next. And what are we missing? Or do we have opportunities on the list that you think really are not useful as OER goes mainstream? And what are we missing? This is, of that 30 people, 5 of us volunteered to draft this first document. And then what we agreed to do is put it out to everybody and get comments, feedback, and we'll continue to take the responsibility to put out new versions. We'll do this in an open, transparent way. Nicole, we're dedicating the doc in the public domain, is that right? So it's under C. So take it, reuse it, do whatever you want with it. But the idea is that we'll take lots of feedback, and eventually we as a community will point at it and say, yeah, that's pretty good. It may not be exactly what I want, but I can see where I might participate here. Or this framework is generally helpful for what I'm trying to do at my university. So that's what I'm trying to get at. So this is a list of people. You can see we've got folks from all over the world, from many different organizations, but the most important feedback is not from us, it's from the practitioners in the field, it's from you. So you already know the conference hashtag. Please get ready with this OER hashtag, and hopefully we'll get a little bit of feedback now. So the first category, and these are really questions for you, is we explored to what extent do you think that we need market penetration with OER in order for OER to go mainstream. So a few examples of that. Do we need to, quote unquote, disrupt education materials and services market so that OER is the primary model? It's the first thing that faculty think about as they're building their courses. Do we need to shift some public funding models to pay for publishing services? So in the United States, the US Department of Labor put out $2 billion for community colleges to build entire academic programs. And so 100 community colleges around the United States right now, and their partners building not just courses, but entire academic programs, and anything they build or revise with grant funds is under a CC BY license. Do we need more of that kind of policy? Mainstreaming OER among educators, so the traditional publishing models, and how do we get to sufficient quality of OER to provide choice? A lot of faculty say, thank you for showing me that open calculus textbook, or thanks for showing me that course on statistics. I don't want one choice, I want 3 choices. And they all need to be really, really great, and I want to be impressed, just like I'm impressed when the publishers come to my door in my office. So if you tweet a bit, feel free to use these ideas or others. What is it going to take in terms of market penetration before you think the faculty you work with, the students you work with, the institutions you work with will shift to OER? What does market penetration look like? It's going to have to be a quick tweet because I'm going to move forward. So market penetration. All right, next one. And feel free just to start tweeting because I'm going to move rather quickly here. What are the top strategic? We are, even though we are robust, we are strong, we're loud, we're pretty small. And so we're going to have to focus. What should we be focusing on as a global community? And of course, we have division of labor, right? We all don't have to do open licensing. Creative Commons, we'll do that. Right, we'll make sure that the open licenses work in every country, that they're compliant with copyright law, that they're defended well in courts, et cetera. We've got that one, right? What is it that we need to focus on that's not happening? So a few ideas here. Building OER to fill the gaps. So a lot of times I'll be on a university campus and a professor will raise her hand and say, look, I teach engineering and I've looked and I'm just not finding the textbooks I need, or I'm just not finding the courses, or the simulations, or the videos. And so are there areas that we need to, and should we focus on building OER there? Do we need to develop open policies, such that publicly funds are openly licensed? Develop national OER models or strategies that can be replicated in other countries? Creating community in a grassroots manner. What do you think of these? And here's another set. We have lots of opportunities. Should we be challenging this idea of, or solving the problem of discovery and reuse? I can tell you Creative Commons right now, our search tool sucks, to be completely frank, and we are revamping and building a brand new one so that when you go to CC, you can type in any string and it's going to feed back to you as it'll say, here's all the textbooks, here's all the courses, here's all the videos, here's all the simulations. We're trying to make a more user-friendly tool. Many of us think that we need better communications about the value of OER. We only hit the mainstream press rarely. The Guardian is actually one of the best newspapers in the world at talking about OER because of the good work that you're all doing. But most big publications that the public reads never talk about open educational resources. Very, very rare. It's only when those of us who are out there pushing on those press contacts make that happen, right? And if we want to get into the mainstream, we're going to have to change that public discussion. Everybody's got their tweets out. Strategic priorities. Okay, the next question is, are these the challenges that we're facing in the OER community? Linear rate of growth, right? How do we get to potential? Absence of standards. So this is something that we've learned from the open access movement. Yes, we've got essentially agreement on definition. Yes, we have standard licensing, but we don't have what the open access movement has, where they've kind of standardized on green and gold access models, and the idea that part of the budget of one's grant goes to paying for gold access, right? There's some standards which have emerged. In the open data space, there's the 5-star open data standard, right? Are there some tools, some standards that would be useful in the OER movement? There might be, there might not. Insufficient awareness, I think that one's a given. That's something that we're going to have to figure out how to scale and solve. Difficulty of discovery and reuse, right? We talked about that. Inconsistent breadth and depth. In OER, we've got most of the OER is frankly in the STEM fields. It's in science, technology, engineering, and math. That's expanding, but that's where it started. Mostly enrolled courses, which makes sense, right? That's where the students are. That's where we should start. That was a good play. But as we get into the long tail of enrollments in your institutions, we have very limited OER out as the tail gets thinner. So how do we engage those faculty? All right, demand. So keep tweeting. This is all good feedback. So on demand here, let me be clear what we mean by demand. So we broke down these categories by demand, which is really about the awareness and the motivation to use OER, supply, what's the content and the tools to use OER, and capacity, what's the community and systematic support of sustainability. So let me start with demand. We have a lot of research, we looked at some of that, but when you talk with faculty, what do you need? Is that research sufficient, or do you need additional case studies? What's the evidence base? What are the arguments, data, and peer-reviewed research that you need when you walk in to a faculty member's office or a teacher's classroom to convince them that moving to OER is a good idea? What does that look like? And how would that improve the demand for OER? What do we need to do around communications? And communications is a recurring theme here. How do we engage constituencies? Many of us around the world are engaging librarians and student groups in ways that we haven't traditionally done so, and finding a lot of success there. So I can assure you that when you sit down and talk with students about OER, as I know many of you do, it just makes sense to them. They want to co-create knowledge. They certainly want free textbooks in their class, and they get very excited about it. And when they find out that they're going to walk into their next class and the textbooks cost 150 pounds, they're very unhappy about that, right? And so how do you engage students? How do you get students to press the administration so that the course catalog marks which courses have open textbooks in them, or which courses use OER? You want to put pressure on the other faculty in your institution? That's the way to do it, right? And then this one I find particularly interesting. How do you coordinate supply with demand? So if there's engineering faculty all around the world, or arts faculty all around the world that say, yes, we're ready, we want to do OER, but there's no OER there, and here's what we need. How do we make sure that there's an effort to produce what they need and what they want? In the United States right now, this type of conversation is happening around K curriculum in math and English language arts, because the United States standards called Common Core, and not all, 43 of the states have these new standards, and they have formed a consortia, at least 13 of those states, to build OER for math and English language arts. They have a demand, they're actually building the supply, and the way they're building it is they're taking millions of US dollars and putting them out in competitive RFPs, and they're inviting commercial for-profit publishers to build for them the they need. But what's different is they are keeping the copyright, and they're putting a CC BY license on everything they build, so that all of the states have the legal rights to modify them as they see fit. That's coordinating with demand with supply. So let's take a little look at supply. What might we do on the supply side? Keep tweeting. Should we focus on what a lot of people call productization of OER? Now, this flies in the face a little bit of what I just said Brian Lamb was talking about, right? If you productize education content, do you also, you run the risk of productizing and creating an artificially stable education space where pedagogy might be too rigid, right? So we don't want that. On the other hand, if you walk into a faculty member and you're trying to convince them to move to open, both pedagogically and content, And you can't match at least what they have today in terms of convenience, what they call quality, effectiveness, if you can't give them a replacement set of content that meets their needs. So what I mean by that, if I walk into John's classroom, I say, John, you have a textbook that costs 175 pounds, let me replace it with this OER textbook. And John says, look, the textbook's great, but where's my slide deck? Where's my test bank? Where's everything I need to make my life easy and provide the supplemental resources and the sample tests, etc. If I can't offer that to John, he may not move, and then it's very difficult to talk to him about open practices in pedagogy. So how do we create exactly what the faculty are asking for? And again, we look back to the research to see some of that. Building supply to meet demand, right? So again, how do we think about what the demand is and build the supply around it? Accessibility is interesting. In many areas, higher education institutions especially, are saying, wow, we actually have a national law which requires that everything we do is accessible to anybody that walks through our classroom, and retrofitting courses are very expensive. Well, of course, with open educational resources, the open license allows not only them, but their institution, but also NGOs around the world who are experts in to revise courses and make them accessible. And then how do we open up existing platforms and resources? Is there a set of copyrighted content somewhere that if it was open, that you'd have a lot of uptake of that? And how can you engage with those? Sometimes it's publishers, sometimes it's a department at your university. How do you engage in a conversation and persuade the copyright holder to put an open license on it? Similarly, how do we work with platforms? So at Creative Commons, we spend a lot of time working with Apple and Google and Facebook and learning systems and you name it. Any place where educators are engaged in creating, sharing, posting content, and making it really easy to add an open license to both add it and then display it and provide proper attribution. The capacity, keep tweeting, are these the right list? What do we need to do in terms of national mainstreaming, international growth, leveraging this idea of open as an aspect of digital in education? So let me pick on this one for a minute. I guarantee you, doesn't matter what country you're in, your country has some kind of national initiative right now in the National Department of Education or Ministry of Education around moving to digital, right? So find that report, find who's in charge of it, and go in and engage with them and say, look, if you want digital content with your digital initiatives, with your devices, all right, and you want to have the most effective, efficient, well-sorted, and low-cost content mechanism, let's preload all those devices with OER. Let's build in OER. If you want to see a great example of this, talk with from Poland. They actually paired their OER initiative in elementary education and what they're doing around open textbooks with a broader initiative around moving to digital. 2 minutes? Well, good. It's a good thing I'm out of time here. And out of. All right, so let me stop there. I'm going to come back and bring up the URL just one more time so you can have it. And we've got about 1 minute for questions, which is perfect. Although let me just say, I'm here the entire conference. I'll be here till Friday. I'm happy to chat with you. And let me, now that you've got the URL, let me put my information up on the screen. There's my email. Feel free to email me, although I'll warn you, I'm very behind in my email. If you want to get my attention, Twitter's better. I'm at cgreen on Twitter. That's also a good way just to kind of keep track of not only what am I working on, but more important, smart people around the world, what they're working on. I post what I see in my travels as well. But that's my email, that's my Twitter handle. And let me stop and open it up for questions. No time for questions. What? One question. No time for questions. I'll see you in the hallway.
So Gabriel should say he's got a session in here straight after with Nicole and Alex. So if you're interested in policy, hang around. If you live in Cardiff, you affectionately called Cardiff the Diff. So I've got I love the diff bag.
I love the diff.
And with lots of Welsh goodies inside.
Thank you.
Thank you.